Hello, everyone, and welcome to this OECD webinar on engaging with education research. And hello also to those joining us on YouTube. Thank you to our panelists and our audience for your willingness to be part of this discussion. My name is Tali Malkin, and I'm part of the Strengthening the Impact of Education Research project here at the OECD. Our project supports countries in understanding how to transform the use of education research into a vital part of policy and practice. I'll be the moderator for today's session. The basis for this webinar is the widely accepted understanding that research evidence can direct stakeholders to informed choices and drive educational progress. But in fact, very few organizations and education systems have a real culture of research use. So we're here today to ask, how can systems foster and support a research engagement culture? Now, to clarify, when we talk about research engagement, we distinguish that from other terms, such as research use or evidence uptake. These terms usually refer to the direct application of research evidence, while we focus on engagement. That means we attribute a more active role to practitioners and policymakers who adopt strategies to integrate research into their work. Ideally, they critically reflect on the research evidence. They would collectively deliberate about its meaning and integration. And engagement can also involve interacting with researchers, for example, to jointly produce research. So today, we're excited to announce that we recently published a short education spotlight, which reflects on the elements at the system level that are crucial for establishing a culture of research engagement. It's already on our website, so check it out. The link will be in the chat shortly. And my colleague Jordan will share some insights from it in just a moment. After that, we wish to discuss how systems can develop the right conditions at the system level to best support education research engagement, for it to be effective and systematic. And to help us explore this, we have a wonderful panel of experts with us today, tuning in from 4 continents and bringing their extensive experience and diverse backgrounds within the education and research realms. Actually, for most of the panel, it's either early in the morning or late at night. So I'd like to especially thank you for this effort. To our audience, please get involved in the discussion. The Zoom chat is open. Just post your questions and comments, and we'll get to as many as possible before the end of the webinar. So with that, to frame and start our discussion, Jordan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tali. I'll just share my screen. Please tell me if there's a problem. Oh no. Second. I need to share the PPT. Do you see the PPT?
Yes, we do.
Yep, that's okay. Okay, fantastic. So thank you very much, Tali, and hello, everybody. I will just briefly go through a few of the findings from the spotlight that Tali mentioned before. So we've just published this spotlight, and I would again encourage everyone to go and take a look. It draws on data from our 2 full-length reports and uses it to analyze a concrete topic. It seeks to answer these 2 questions. So which systemic conditions matter for the development of an organizational and system level culture of research engagement? And how can these conditions be developed to best support this? And for those of you who don't know, the idea behind a spotlight, it's a bit different from a regular OECD publication. It's very short, just 8 pages. The idea is to be concise, accessible, and visual for as many people as possible. So the spotlight itself draws on the data from our 2021 policy survey with responses from 37 ministries of education representing 29 countries. The figure that you see here really pulls the whole spotlight together, and it brings all the elements that we think from our work have a crucial role in enabling a culture of research engagement in systems. So at the center, you see actors, the ones who are actually engaging with research, and they're often doing this through complex social processes that require quality relationships that you can see here around them. But the actors need help from the system. For example, through learning opportunities, which can empower them with a range of skills and mindsets to engage with research in a high quality way. Now, around these relationships and actors, there are three interconnected systemic factors, which we think can help them have these skills, mindsets, and engage with research. So having appropriate resources, having appropriate structures and processes, and having appropriate incentives. And finally, you'll see here that leadership really is one of the foundations of everything. And it's here as a kind of cornerstone and to ensure that these enablers are present at all levels, organizational, local, and system. So you can see here structures and processes. Now, they're important to facilitate the generation of relevant research and support interactions between actors. We asked systems from a list of a dozen mechanisms which were present to facilitate the use of education research in their system. You can see 5 of them here. Systems generally reported quite a few mechanisms, yet the ministries also told us that a lack of mechanisms continues to be one of their most critical barriers. So what could explain this? Well, our data suggests that some of these existing mechanisms may be ineffective or inadequately coordinated. For example, you'll see here that over half of systems said that synthesizing and disseminating research through user-friendly tools was a mechanism that they have in their systems. Yet, many of these systems still report low accessibility of research as a barrier. And when we look at system-wide structures, you see at the bottom here, strategy for facilitating the use of research. These coordination mechanisms are among the least reported in our data. Now, even if we have the presence of well-coordinated mechanisms, it's not going to make a difference if the system is not sufficiently resourced. So we also asked systems about resources for using research. Now, this chart shows the percentage of respondent ministries that agreed or strongly agreed that a given resource is present at an adequate level in their system. You can see here that networks and databases were among the most adequate resource. And human resources a little bit less. But there's still a large minority of systems, for example, that perceive there to be insufficient networks and databases. Now, when it comes to practice, around 2/3 of systems did not perceive supportive leadership. This is quite a large percentage. So finally, just going to lack of time. Time is something that there's never enough of. And lack of time to access and use research is a shared challenge for 3/4 of policymakers and practitioners. But the important point is that when we think about time, the rest of these resources should be working to help lift the burden of time and make engagement with research more efficient and less time consuming. So it's important to think about not just do we need more resources, but how can we best optimize existing resources that may be in the system. And finally, incentives. Incentives and rewards can positively influence research engagement. And we ask systems to choose from a list of 8 incentives, which ones a given stakeholder has access to. You can see the stakeholders at the bottom there. When it comes to being involved in research production. So importantly, this is research production. Now, the chart shows 4 of the incentives. We've classified them by either extrinsic or intrinsic. Overall, academic incentives were the most numerous, but when you look at salary supplements and job descriptions, these tend to reward faculty for their influence on other academics, mostly through publishing, and this actually leaves little time to engage with policymakers or practitioners. By contrast, teachers and policymakers often have more intrinsic incentives and generally have very few extrinsic incentives to engage in research production. We know that system-level incentives like secondment schemes can have a big impact. And we also know that the role of research funders is crucial in terms of how they use their grant-making rules to reward socially impactful research. I think I'll stop there. Hopefully that was fine time-wise. Thank you, Tali.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Yeah, it was great. And I think these insights lead us directly to our panelists. Just a brief comment. Being conscious of time, I'll introduce each panelists very briefly. You can find further details on the webinar webpage. Also, I'll ask all panelists a rather similar question, which is, from your perspective and experience, how can systems help practitioners and policymakers to actively integrate research into their work? And what is the role of leadership in all this? So our first panelist to speak today is Vicky Colbert, the founder and executive director of Fundación Escuela Nueva in Colombia. Vicky is a sociologist at Javeriana University and has previously held senior positions at the Colombian Ministry of Education and UNICEF. She's been granted several awards in the fields of leadership and social entrepreneurship. So Vicky, from your very diverse experience, which system-level conditions were most impactful in encouraging research engagement in Colombia? And how can the system support even the more remote organizations and schools, in your opinion?
Okay, well, first of all, greetings from Colombia. And although this panel is on education research, I want to clarify, I'm a practitioner, not a researcher. And Fundación Escuela Nueva is a Colombian NGO. Well, first, from the design stage, we incorporated monitoring and evaluation as a central piece of the change we wanted to make. And the design involved all key change actors from the very beginning. So the research and evidence-based mentality is part of the innovation. It is not an add-on as an external activity. This is essential for change to take place. We were focusing on social change. So the engagement of key actors of the system includes teachers, students, parents, and administrators. And this is what is a systemic approach, and also especially from the bottom up. For us, it was crucial to start a bottom-up approach. The engagement of all key actors included the teachers, the students, the parents, the administrators. That is what generated the system impact. In addition to this, you need to make sure that the key decision makers engage direct with the change experience on the ground so that they make a commitment. If a head of planning, goes visits a remote rural school, they become much more aware of what a teacher in remote rural areas of Colombia have to go through. So they appreciate it more. And this for us was crucial. So we involved them from the beginning. And I think so the design, implementation, and expansion of the Escuela Nueva model has relied on research and the use of evidence as a central component of the innovation. The initial design considered existing concepts and proven practices. The pilot phase and initial expansion to several regions of Colombia were closely followed by the technical team to learn, adapt, and advance based on the evidence derived from the practice of those involved. So the reliance on research was critical to credibility to expand the innovation in Colombia and in the global South. So we followed three paths. The review of existing specialized knowledge and research results to inform the design of our pedagogical model, the curriculum design, the training strategies. Second, the measurement of impact in collaboration with universities, research institutions, Colciencias, the National Institute of Research in Colombia, National Planning Department of Colombia, which is so important and has played an important role through so many years. The international organizations such as the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, UNICEF, UNESCO, USAID, and others. If you want to work with them, they always ask you to have research behind. So from the beginning, we had to have it. So the generation of knowledge from the innovation by the key players on the ground and the use in constantly adjusting, improving, and building upon the innovation. This path is less known, but it is perhaps the most important to ensure the rooting and sustainability of the Escuela Nueva innovation. So I can elaborate more later on this path because I think it's so important. Do I still have time to continue? Do you want me to elaborate more on this path?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
so
you can take another minute or so. Sure.
So both designers and education agents, particularly the teachers in the schools that have adopted the innovation, generate, share, discuss, and use the knowledge generated by their experience in the process of adopting and adapting the innovation in their daily practice. They learn from the context and the conditions under which they implement the Escuela Nueva. And based on this continuous learning, perform adaptation in their pedagogical practice, the evaluation of learning and curriculum development. This is shared through what we call teacher learning circles or microcenters and fit back to the general educational model. We actually have now Nueva after COVID. So we had a community of practice, and even with remote rural teachers, it was just amazing. We opened this community of practice and 7,000 popped in. Now we have 2,000. So the path of research and evaluation implies a generation of knowledge from the practice and to improve the practice and ensures unique advantages, which in a way explain the sustained success of Escuela Nueva innovation for several decades. It's one of the longest bottom-up innovations of the developing world that's still being sustained. And one of the reasons is because it's always had research and evaluation behind. And some of the unique advantages is that it is useful for simultaneously understanding and adapt to diverse contexts and conditions. We have a very rich different cultures in Colombia. It generates emerging and timely knowledge to make decisions which are more accurate and relevant at the local level. It fosters the appropriation of the pedagogical innovation by the key actors of the learning process, that is teachers, students, parents, and local leaders, and it allows a better understanding of the context and conditions to be transformed. So I guess this is our experience.
Perfect. That is really fascinating. Thank you very much, Vicky. Next, I turn to Makito Yulita, a professor at the National Institute of School Teachers and Staff Development in Japan. Makito has worked, among other things, on developing a system-wide measurement tool to identify teachers' needs. He's also a board member at the Japanese Society for the Study on Teacher Education. So, Yurita-san, the Japanese lesson study approach is a known good practice for research engagement. How does the system and your institute support this? And does this mean that this is not a problem in Japan?
Hey, thank you for your nice introduction, and I'm excited to be here. My background is actually philosophy and teacher education, so it's a little bit a different take I may do. And I also appreciate the recognition of the Japanese lesson study approach, and we have actually a long history of research engagement in Japan. So lesson study involves a collaborative planning, observation, and discussion amongst the teachers, and it's a unique form of research engagement rooted in the teacher autonomy. And it aims to improve the pedagogical skills and address the practical issues. While highly effective, its success hinges on the well-defined objectives and questions that are meaningful for research engagement. Without these, and the lesson study risks becoming superficial, losing its essence as a powerful research tool. So implementing lesson study system-wide to foster a culture of research engagement is a challenge. It's because in principle, it's a field-based and inquiry-oriented research practice itself, and that is built upon a practitioner's autonomy. So with many policy failures in the past, that we should know by now that good practice don't always translate well to broader systems. So we must think critically about how system can support this approach without compromising its core values. So it's also important to remind us all that effective implementation of the lesson study isn't just about acquisition of knowledge and skills. So it's about fostering a capacity for self-directed, inquiry-oriented research practice among practitioners. So without such capacity, that the lesson study can lose its relevance, and reducing its effectiveness. So as a system, how we involve in the lesson study is a kind of touchy issues. So, and also by capacity, that I don't mean that what a practitioner need to attain, such as knowledge and skills. The most educators, often with advanced degrees, already possess the necessary knowledge and skill to appreciate and value research and research use. So we must give today's practitioner more credit. And many would argue that for fully utilizing such capacity requires time, funding, and other resources, and offer incentives such as teacher prizes. But it's easier said than done, actually. Unfortunately, that the education sector often lacks political strength in front of other competing priorities in society. So what can be done? So what can the system do to support fostering a culture of research engagement in education? Namely through the lesson study approach. So at my institute, we've adopted a pragmatic approach focusing on the data and the evidence. And I know that it's the same old data and evidence, but it's not exactly the same. Here that we take on data and evidence, not for accountability purposes, but to drive meaningful dialogue in education. So evidence for accountability comes with a set of standards or expected goals that are externally defined. And such evidence is commonly discussed in a connection to EBPM or evidence-informed practice in education. Instead, I introduce here a new approach called the EDDE, which stands for Evidence-Driven Dialogue for Education. This evidence aims to stimulate critical discussions among educators, igniting deeper sense of mission and responsibility in their professional roles. Traditional evidence for accountability drives practitioner and the policymaker to meet the goals and objectives in externally defined standards or measurement tools. For a long time, our institution has focused on the designing of professional development programs against such standard. However, such approach often undermines teachers' autonomy and weakens their professional identity. So in contrast, EDDE invokes professionalism of educators to reflect critically on their practice and the state of education. So we craft evidence that would awaken professionalism and a sense of mission in the practitioners. So instead of having us set goals and objectives, we let evidence and data provoke meaningful questions that lead practitioners to engage in thoughtful and critical reflection about the state of teaching and the education systems. For example, I don't know if audience knows about Japan's current standing on the International Gender Gap Index. We are very, very low. And so we have tried to equip teachers with knowledge and skills to address this issue. However, the issue still persists, and it's hardly made into the theme of lesson study practice. So instead of externally addressing objectives, we now showcase a set of evidence to display the state of gender equity across Japan. We make such evidence available to stimulate the discussion among practitioners and other stakeholders. So we invoke their sense of mission and professionalism to form a meaningful and well-defined question so that it would make practitioners aware of the issues and give incentives to bring the issue into their lesson study practice. So with EDDE, that we use evidence to empower practitioners and policymakers, navigating a pathway for them to engage with relevant education research that is also relevant to their practice and the issues in our society. So evidence is the source from which the practitioner draws their own questions and the interests and the themes of the development. So in conclusion, that with EDDE, the essence of lesson study becomes fostering a culture of research engagement by empowering teachers as a change agent. It's about inspiring practitioners and policymakers to see themselves as integral to the evolution of education and society at large. I think this is a real incentive, which is not covered in your report, that we can offer as a system to actualize a culture of research engagement in education. So this is what we are practicing today. Thank you very much. I will give you back Mike.
Thank you very much, Ulita-san. These are very interesting thoughts. Thank you again. Our next speaker is Matthew Soldner, the Commissioner for the National Center of Education Evaluation in the U.S. and the Chief Evaluation Officer at the U.S. Department of Education. His expertise includes the design and implementation of complex evaluations and innovative practices, federal financial aid, and statistical policy and practice. So, Matt, as we know, the U.S. is a federal system and education is state level. What can the national level actually do to improve research engagement? We'd love for you to share from your experience. What have you tried that worked? What worked less?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Good morning, everyone, at least here in the US. Before I address that specific question, I want to briefly address the more straightforward use of research evidence by saying that even evidence use can too be a win, although I think you've already heard how there are some caveats to that. As Tali rightly noted, primary and secondary education in the US is largely a state concern, and even individual states vary widely in how much deference they show local education agencies. Within the US context, though, we are lucky to have a federal law that does two things related to evidence use, not engagement, but use. So first, that law outlines a tiered system of evidence that makes a distinction between research of greater or lesser quality as defined by internal validity. So for example, evidence arising from an RCT is privileged over a simple correlational study. Second, that same law says that for some uses of federal funds, states or districts must prioritize the use of evidence-based practices. Now, the benefit to this is that it has sensitized educators and policymakers to the notion of evidence-based practice. And, in fact, it may be driving the implementation of more evidence-based practice. But the risk, of course, and I think you've already heard it alluded to this morning, is that people are simply using evidence as opposed to engaging with it in a high-quality manner. They then may be just uncritically accepting findings without thinking about the implications of the work in their context. And as such, they may hope for positive outcomes, but not realize them. So to that end, I want to describe how we, at least at the US Department of Education, are working toward more active engagement. And most promising, I believe, is the notion of researcher-practitioner partnerships that I suspect many of you are familiar with. In this model, highly qualified researchers work with educators and policymakers over a sustained period, for us up to 5 years, to address educators and policymakers' very specific problems of practice. So my office currently oversees 70 of these partnerships nationwide. Within a partnership, researchers who we pay for work with educators and policymakers to do a few things. First, they work together to identify an issue that is researchable. As part of that, our researchers often provide training on how practitioners should make sense of existing research. Then they work with partnership members to design one or more applied research projects, leveraging local data that teachers and policymakers have that can begin to address that local need. And then finally, in some situations, not as many as we might like, our partners are then involved in actual data analysis and writing up of the findings, so they can begin to build local capacity to do their own work of the same kind, and so they can be engaged in understanding and communicating research findings. Ultimately, whether or not our partners participate in the analysis and writing, our researchers then provide further training on how to interpret the findings and take actionable steps. This is, I think, closer to the kind of engagement that we're talking about and hoping to achieve today. So while I think this model has some promise, it faces many challenges, and you've heard about them already today. Our local partners are often really busy, too busy to participate as fully as we might like. And so we probably are achieving less research engagement than we prefer. And even though we feel like 70 partnerships is a meaningful number, it pales in comparison to the size of our system. There are more than 13,000 public school districts in the United States. So ultimately, a few systemic changes are needed. First, we need a system where our school and district and state leaders receive more intentional training on evidence building and research engagement in their tertiary and graduate education, so more are coming to their roles hungrier to engage with the research evidence than we see today. There's already passion there and enthusiasm, but I think often some earlier engagement in their training would be helpful. Second, and as you've heard and saw in Jordan's slides, our educators and policymakers need more time to meaningfully engage with one another around the research. There is so much on their plates already that competes with time for engagement with research. And finally, we need to continue to partner with the research community to be sure that their research truly is relevant and accessible to the concerns of educators and policymakers. And with that, Talia, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt, for sharing this experience. Very, very interesting. To hear another perspective, we now turn to Elaine Munte, the director of the Knowledge Center for Education in Norway, which is a national research center conducting systemic reviews of education and disseminating relevant research syntheses. Elaine is also a professor of education and has worked extensively with teachers in schools. Elaine, we often hear, as Jordan mentioned before, that academic incentives, such as having to publish in peer-reviewed journals, work against engaging with practitioners and policymakers, leaving little time for such activities. What kind of systemic conditions do you think intermediaries and researchers need to support practitioners and policymakers' engagement with research?
Thank you. Big question. So, thank you for the invitation to be here with you and to discuss this. First of all, of course, we do need to continue publishing and doing research. So, of course, that is something that has to go on. But I think that we're also seeing a change in perspective at the university level too, in an understanding of what universities do and what kind of work goes on in universities. Before, it was primarily research and teaching. Now it's also developing into more of a research, teaching, and collaborative work, and working with others outside the university. In teacher education, you don't just educate teachers, but you also work with teachers in the years to come. There's a lot more of that going on, but I think that's something that we really need to strengthen, that understanding that we stand on 3 legs and not just 2, and that we have that societal role as well to play in the future. And having incentives or working it into work plans and having ways of making that very obvious. It's also about leadership at the university level too, and walking the talk and showing what's important at the leadership level for those that work at the universities as well. And that it's something that the university does to build relationships. So have those relationships established and have the networks established so that new researchers have something to move into, and that it's not up to the individuals to do this as well, not just up to the individual researcher. I think that's one way to strengthen that research, is to make us aware that this is what we expect of people that work at universities too. Your research should be relevant as well. So that's one thing. But we also have the aspect of research funding, which very often stops when you get to the dissemination part. So funding research, we might have to have a clear dissemination plan, but the dissemination is really all about publishing and not about disseminating for engagement. So the fact that you need to work on what goes on afterwards isn't as obvious. And I think that's something that we can look at the funding agencies as well, to get more emphasis on what comes after the research has been completed, and to sort of following it out into the workspaces. And a third issue, I think something that's going on now in Norway is quite interesting. The fact that school development, it might be a little bit like you were talking about, Vicky, but that school development is a bottom-up approach. But in order to get funding for school development in the municipalities or counties, you have to collaborate with the university. So it's sort of an incentive to collaborate, and it's also seen as a systemic way to get researchers involved with practitioners and opposite, and to try to create those synergies where research is introduced or discussed, is a part of what's going on in school development, but that the researchers also get input on what are the relevant research questions, because that's also extremely important, that we work together so that we know too what kind of research we need for the future and what kind of research is needed in the schools, so that our research is more relevant in that sense. And I think that through these RPPs, we might also have the opportunity to see researchers and schools or communities working together as change agents. And that can also involve the researchers in a different way and make them also more social agents as well. So I think those 3 areas are some of the areas that we might need to look into when it comes to creating better opportunities for researchers to involve in this kind of work.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for this perspective. Very fascinating. I appreciate it. So now it's time for our Q&A session. Our audience, please write your questions in the Zoom chat if you haven't done so yet. And I think I'll just start with a question of my own on an aspect that interests all of us, I think, which is leadership. So we know that both OECD and international research suggest that leadership is key in developing a culture of research engagement at all levels, actually. So I was wondering, from your different perspectives, what can systems do to ensure that leadership fulfills this expectation? Can we start with you, Makito?
Okay, I think it's a difficult question that but it's important to remember. But I think it's important to remember that the leadership is not a monolithic concept. What the leadership means differs across different cultural landscape and organization structure. And for example, in egalitarian settings, the approach and the impact of leadership are quite different from those in a hierarchical system. So it's a bit oversimplified to stress leadership as a key to developing a culture of research engagement, I believe. And also in the same vein that I'm also a bit concerned to say that the leadership plays a vital role in optimizing time and other resources for research engagement. Because it is true that the leadership is important to secure the resources at the local level, but attributing the responsibility to local leadership sounds somewhat like systems offloading their responsibility onto local leaders and practitioners. And that's what I'm concerned about. So having said that, there are some ways in which the system can support leadership at all levels in developing a culture of research engagement, I believe. By providing a leadership with access to data and evidence in a usable format, a system can support the formulation of well-defined research questions and objectives. And without such clarity, the engagement with education research risks being superficial or fragmented. So leadership plays an essential role in setting the common grounds for research engagement, but shortening such a role would require the system support, of course. And in relation to this, I think the system must spearhead the discussion on transforming the development and training of leadership across the board. Consider Japan, for example, that where many in a leadership position come from administrative background, often lacking in research experience. And so to truly foster a culture of research engagement in education, we must critically reevaluate our hiring practice and promoting leaders. It's up to the system to initiate this change and take responsibility for reshaping how we access to and develop our educators and leaders. So while leadership is indispensable in cultivating a research engaged culture, it is only part of the equation. And we have to understand this part, I think. And a more holistic approach involving both leaders and system is essential and for meaningful progress in education. But nobody really want to change the system, the current practice. And that's a major issue. Research field, practice field, and the system side. Nobody really want to change this aspect. So how are we going to create the cohesion? I mean, unite a voice. I mean, that is, I think, the major issue at this point.
I believe. Thank you. So don't blame the leaders for everything. Elaine, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that's very interesting to think about, because we know that leadership is distributed as well, and but that can vary from country to country and from school to school or organization to organization. So I think that's an important perspective when we talk about leadership at different levels. It's about roles and responsibilities, and what kind of roles do we need also in the different organizations in order to create more of research engagement culture. So that I think too would be interesting to look into. We know we have some good examples of schools that do work in very research engaging ways. What kind of roles are there? Do they specify that? What kind of responsibilities do people take on? Could be a good way to start looking at how we can think about leadership at different levels when it comes to research engagement. So yeah, so interesting perspectives.
Thank you very much. That is interesting. Matt, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I'll pick up on the don't blame the leader theme. I guess I would just lean into, you cannot assume that leaders know how. And when I think about leaders, really I am thinking about school level leaders who are working directly with educators to implement evidence-based practice in the classroom. Do not assume school leaders have the knowledge and training to do this. I think we've all mentioned there needs to be some sort of change in tertiary graduate education that kind of prepares folks to better do this. As a real concrete example, right now, we're in the process of developing 10 distinct professional learning community kind of toolkits on various types of evidence-based practice that in K-12 education. And importantly, it is not just a peer learning community for teachers. There's a whole separate model for building leaders, talking about what are the kinds of things you need to do in the systems, in your schools, to make it possible for educators to use this information. What about schedules? What about making time for teachers to get together and talk? What about dealing with salary and pay and all those things? So you have to give resources to leaders to make this possible. And I think perhaps we haven't done quite as much of that as we ought.
Okay, thank you. Vicky?
The concept of leadership is empowering your followers. So I really wanted the teachers were the main agents of change. So let me tell you what we did. What was our process? I had the great opportunity to go to a very good school at Stanford University. I did my part of my work there, where I interacted with researchers with a firm commitment to impact the system when I came back to Colombia. So I looked for the opportunity to engage directly with rural teachers who were already trying to innovate. But I mean, I was aware of the importance of research, and that was important. So those are local leaders. I wanted to, innovate, to support them, who engaged with me in a partnership for change, beginning where they were and building and improving on what already existed. So eventually, as I became, this is my personal story, I became the national coordinator of Escuela Nueva in the Ministry of Education. So I was able to bring the teachers, the rural teachers, as a ferment, as a seed for change at the middle and at the top. So this is not easy because bureaucrats reject that rural teachers because they did not have the academic requirements in the Ministry of Education. We were sort of isolated. They looked at us in a strange way, but I integrated them in my team, having a balance between researchers and practitioners. And this was crucial because the teachers had the experience and knowledge bureaucrats did not have at the Ministry of Education. This is not easy. I cannot say you can replicate it, but it requires persistence and patience. And of course, this is an issue that cannot be generalized. But for me, this was crucial. I brought the rural teachers into, as in the picture, in the main picture, as the leaders. And with them, we conquered the other teachers. It was much easier than through the bureaucrats.
Thank you. That's very innovative for certain systems, for sure. I see that we have a lively chat and we gathered some questions. We tried to put them together if they're on similar topics. I'm going to start with a question that came similarly from Tomasz from Ireland, Wangpo from China, and Laura from Italy. And the question is, are we framing engagement with research in the context of children's needs? And what support do you provide to teachers to motivate them to use research-based innovation in improving the quality of learning? Vicky, maybe we can start with you, if that's good. What do you think? Or anybody else who wants to
repeat, Tal, repeat the exact question.
Okay, sorry. Are we framing engagement with research in the context of children's needs? What support do you provide to teachers to motivate them to use research-based innovation in improving quality of learning?
Well, the way we introduce the innovation is, I think that was important because first we started with some demo schools and we would bring the teachers to see, because at that moment when we started, the critical issue was how to universalize basic education in Latin America and improve quality, which is still an issue, a big problem. But so we would take teachers to see a school and see they have a visual image of what they would, what we wanted to do with children. So they immediately would say, I can do that. You know, this was important because if you bring them with a lot of theory, they get scared. So the first thing was the visual image they would see, because you're working with attitudes and behaviors, and you have to think how to change attitudes and behaviors. So engaging the stakeholders that make the real change was crucial. So they would see the school working. The second thing is that we changed the way of training the teachers. You know, we had to compensate for what faculties of education were not doing. The teachers would go with the same methodologies, be trained with the same methodologies they would be using with their children. This was so important. And the last thing was not leave them alone. So here where we started these community, you know, these micro centers or teachers learning circles. So because, you know, we were talking about children's rights, and everybody talks about human rights, but they forget children's rights. And here I just want to highlight the importance of UNICEF and the leadership. I myself worked in UNICEF. So I afterwards, after I had started Escuela Nueva, but it was just so crucial to show and have results. And the first thing we did in evaluation was measure self-esteem of children. If we saw children were improving their self-esteem, you know, they were blossoming. So for us, it was so important to highlight and emphasize the importance of working with the children and making them as the main actors.
Thank you, Vicky. That is super important. Makito or somebody else would like to refer to this question as well before we move to the next one?
It's a bit difficult to respond to that, but yes, I agree with Vicky, what she's talking about, but at the same time, I was also thinking about the research, the engagement with the research is not necessary to just respond to that. No, so let me just rephrase it. When we say children's need, it seems like we understand what we are talking about. But in reality, that education is an act of political act political act done for the social good, public good. So we have to understand the children's need in relation to the public good. And that perspective is oftentimes missing in the current education discourse. We talk about the children as individual learning needs, but the individual learning needs is also set on the ground of the social and public needs. And what sort of society we want to create, what sort of social condition we are in, and in which, what sort of situation that children are in. And that's the way that we have to think about children's need. In order to understand that, in order to situate the children's needs to the public good, we have to do the research. And that's the way that we can motivate, create a sense of mission amongst the teachers and the practitioners and also policymakers. This is a mission that everyone can share in a society. And with that ground, we do the research to identify what the children's need. And in that way, there's no miscommunication between human rights and children's rights. And so that the way that we deliver the discourse is somewhat missing, I think. So that's why that we are presenting the approach to the EDDE to using the evidence to discuss about having a dialogue about education. So that's my take.
Thank you so much. Matt, would you like to add something?
Can I just say one thing? And I speaking only to the notion of what questions are being asked or what problems are being engaged with, and showing an area where I think we have a lot of work to grow. We use researcher practitioner partnerships because we think it allows us to engage more directly with folks on the ground, which we usually interpret to mean building leaders or teachers. But what we are not good at, and if any of the panelists or folks in the audience want to share, is how are we engaging with families and communities? That's where I see we have not yet leaned in. I think increasingly we are talking with researchers about engage with teachers. Very difficult. Even more difficult, engage authentically with communities and children if they're able to, how they can contribute to the conversation. So that is the next step, which we have not gotten to. And so we are in search of solutions, which I would take from anyone.
Thank you. If it's okay, I'll move on to the next question. Okay, cool. So there's a question from Mona Nabhani. How can developing countries benefit from some of these presented practices? How transferable do you think are these practices from one context to another? perhaps they need some modifications. Anybody who would like to answer this? So this is about transferring practices to different contexts. Elaine, yeah, right.
Yes, I mean, whether you transfer from developing countries to other countries or wherever, there's always the question of context and transference and adaptation. So I think that would really be something that matters no matter what. But there can be some principles, there can be some guidelines that you might want to look at that can be relevant to develop further. For instance, when it comes to lesson study, Makito, that's used all over the world now, but it's not necessarily used in the same way all over. There can be contextual differences. But I think that still we see the same kind of structures, and we also see some of the same difficulties with introducing lesson study in very many of the countries. And one of the main difficulties is staying long enough in that exploring research and knowledge phase and not going too quickly over to finding the solutions phase. So sort of being aware of what can be difficult in different countries too can, I think, inform us. We do have a lot we can learn from each other without necessarily just doing ABC, but finding out what A should look like here and how we can use these different steps of a process or whatever. Research is in many ways international, but has to be contextualized and local as well.
Right. So it's true for any kind of context switching, not only.
No, I think so. I mean, there's probably some places where it's not the case.
Right.
We can't say for certain.
Right. Vicky?
Well, yes, we let's say Escuela Nueva has been adapted to many countries. It has inspired many educational reforms. For example, countries like Vietnam, no, that have applied Escuela Nueva. So let's say we have the essentials of good child-centered learning. Nothing new. There's nothing new in the philosophy of education. We've known this, what John Dewey said many years ago, what Maria Montessori, what Piaget. So what we do is really the essential of really child-centered, cooperative, self-paced learning, because for us, necessity was the mother of innovation. So we had to incorporate self-paced learning, cooperative learning where children learn to dialogue. And then at the end, this was necessity. And at the end, we saw this is what everybody wants and everybody's needing. So since we learned to do it in a simple way, so we sort of have a basic, and we also saw that teachers don't have time for planning, lesson plans. And in the rural isolated multi-grade schools, less. So one of the things we really emphasized was what are the essentials we can adapt in the global South. And many countries have done it because we have worked with governments and ministries of education, and they adapt Escuela Nueva. So there are certain things that can be general and other things that are locally open-ended. So here we have worked on that to ensure that we have the global desires of, let's say, 21st century skills. I saw somebody was writing about it, good child-centered learning, which is nothing new, but it's basically how to do it, because even in developed countries, you see this learning paradigm hasn't been changed. It's still the traditional content delivery from teachers. And here we wanted just to really get the children as the main actors of change.
Right. Thank you. Elaine, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, it was just a little comment because this is really what research engagement is about. Right? So to be engaged to find out what it can be here locally. So I guess that's what we really need to get more of, that we engage in research locally to find out what we can do.
Yes, thank you. I'll bring in another question about RPPs, actually, that we were talking about. It's from Lotte. Good communication is often mentioned as a crucial factor for success of research practice partnerships. But what does good communication consist of? Is the question. Matt, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, so certainly I would say good communication at a minimum in the context of an RPP means the researcher half at least needs to come to the table really interested in hearing the authentic needs of those with whom they are partnering, not just interested in bringing their research interest or their specific methodological expertise to the table. I think it really is being humble and then being honest with one another about what is and is not possible, what the researcher can truly deliver, and the level of engagement that the practitioner can provide. So it is authentic listening, is being fully transparent about what you can accomplish together and what the constraints and kind of barriers to working might be. And then like any relationship, sticking with it through the good times and the bad times until you achieve on behalf of the kids and learners, communities, that which you set out to achieve in the beginning.
Thank you. Anybody else who would like to add on that?
Let me join that one. I think I think the good communication is like a tango. You know, it's we have to understand the balance of power. When the researcher involves, system involves, the school leader involves, the teacher involves, community involves, there's always a power balance. And what the good communication is when the power balance is, both parties, the multiple parties agrees on the one things, and in terms of, creating feeding the sense of equal power, the fairness between in relationship. So in terms of research, in order to develop the research engagement, I think that what is important is who set the goals and objectives for doing the research. I mean, oftentimes we tend to think that the teacher need to learn or leader need to be trained, and that students has to be learned. And in some sense, we often approach with a sort of a colonial kind of approach. We have a knowledge, we have a skill, we have a mission, and we are giving that sort of doing some favor to those people who have a deficit. And so in some sense that those kind of relationship has to be maintained, it has to be critically examined. And in order to do that, I think it's important for us to consciously aware of who set the goals for doing research and who set the objective of doing the research and such.
I have to stop you there. We're running out of time, but with this wonderful tango image, let's finish off with a round of super short answers, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
So what would be your single most important recommendation to facilitate research engagement in policy or practice? You have 15 seconds each. So Elaine, unmute.
There, take some time to unmute. Sorry. No, I think that what I started with, for at least from the academic perspective, that we really need to put this on the agenda at the universities, that we're working also outside the universities with people, and we're doing it in partnerships.
Thank you. Matt?
All right, as pragmatic as this is, for system leaders, you have got to be sure that there are incentives to engage with research that outweigh the many, many frictions that exist that would otherwise prevent it. We hope people will engage with research because it is the right thing to do, and that is not enough.
Wonderful. Vicky?
Yes, well, for me, I'll say to engage the stakeholders that make the real change in the design and the process of change from the beginning. As I mentioned, attitudes and behaviors are involved. And of course, here I agree with Matthew, provide resources and the incentives. You need to have the resources. We had the resources at the moment because we were supported. So from USAID, from the government, from the different international organizations, from the banks. So you need to have the resources. And also, certain stimulus for the teachers, just the micro centers of them getting together from these isolated regions of Colombia, which are so isolated, just getting together and seeing each other and sharing what they were learning was so crucial. And that is one of the reasons the whole concept of social participation crosses the whole intervention.
Thank you so much. Makita, please.
Okay, I have to say that, I should say tango, but better say that I think we should really highlight on the different kind of evidence that we have been using. We have been missing. We have to use the evidence. We have to present the evidence that stimulate the discussion, that stimulate the motivation, and that awaken the professionalism. We have been keep using the evidence of outcome-based evidence, and to call for the accountability. And that actually removes that professionalism out of the teachers and the leaders and from the field. We had to create evidence. We had to present evidence that is calling for this professional missions. And I think that's what, from now on, we really have to focus on doing that one, especially from the research and system side.
Right. Thank you so much. I'd like to wrap up this webinar by saying a huge thank you to our panelists for this fascinating discussion. This is obviously an ongoing conversation. Thank you to our audience for your interest. I invite you to stay tuned to explore the new outputs of the Strengthening the Impact of Education Research project on knowledge mobilization activities and their effectiveness coming later this year. And continue to follow the Edu public webinars. The next one is on Decoding the Hype, Can AI Help Create Accessible and Inclusive Student Learning? That's on February 6th. Check out our webinar's webpage for details and to register. Again, thank you so much to all of you. Bye-bye.